everyone knows that we have social identities and ideological identities. They're religious, they're cultural, they're intellectual, whatever. But nobody's really paid much attention to studying how the representations of that cultural identity alter the manner in which we feel emotion, in which we perceive, and by which we act. I'm interested in how our internal representations of our culture modulate our emotional expression. That's the best way to put it. You know, your brain basically is programmed as you're socialized. That's what socialization is for. And obviously, it's socialization that instills cultural identity. And equally obviously, the process of socialization that leads to cultural identity must have some impact on the way you think, and obviously equally on the way that your mind functions and the way that your brain functions. And see, North American neuropsychologists have been loath to give any consideration to this sort of notion, to think that cultural transformations might have some direct impact on physiological functioning. But the Russians, by contrast, this has been a central tenet of their neuropsychological theories basically since day one. This is particularly true with regards to Alexander Luria and Vygotsky. Now, you can think about this, it's quite obvious if you think about it for a second, with regards to something like the capacity to read silently. Now, it is the case that, well, this is a relatively new talent. I mean, literacy is a new talent, right? Most people weren't able to read 500 years ago. It's only been 500 years, and only for a little bit of that the capacity to read has been widespread. And the capacity to read silently is a relatively new development in human history. Now, it's a peculiar thing if you think about it, that nonetheless, the capacity to read silently localizes to a specific part of the brain, which is to say, it's as if you have a part of the brain that's evolved for that purpose. It's the same place in everybody, more or less. There are individual variations. There are differences when people are lateralized differently, but all that aside, if you learn to silent read, there's a part of your brain that specializes for that, and it's pretty much the same place in everyone, and it wasn't there, or it wasn't doing that sort of activity 2,000 years ago. In fact, I read at one point, I don't know where the reference to this is, like so many things that I make reference to, but I read at one point that people thought Julius Caesar was a magician in part. I mean, he was obviously a remarkable person, but in part because he could read silently. He didn't have to read aloud. So it wasn't just reading that was remarkable, it was being able to read without talking. Anyways, the point of all this is that your brain, this is Luria's view of the brain fundamentally, is your brain is an organ that produces suborgans, culturally specific suborgans. That's its remarkable capacity, is that it can generate new modules that are specialized for certain tasks as a consequence of environmental programming. Well, this is an interesting sort of notion, which is to say that at some level of physiological analysis, at least, your culture determines how your brain works. Now, it's very plastic. You know, your brain's very plastic when you're a child. You can sustain immense amounts of cortical damage in childhood and still grow up normally. For example, if you're very, very epileptic as a child, sometimes what surgeons will do is take out a whole hemisphere, the whole right hemisphere, gone. And children who have hemispherectomies, if they're done young enough, still grow up to be relatively normal. Quite normal, in fact. And there are other cases, too, where people are hydrocephalic, which basically means that their ventricles don't vent properly. And cerebral spinal fluid builds up in the skull, so these people often have skulls that are slightly larger than normal, not necessarily obvious, but still the case. And they end up with a skull that's essentially full of liquid, with a very, very thin layer of brain tissue around this ball of liquid. And there are a number of case reports of people who have like 5% of the cortical tissue intact who have high functioning intelligences and normal personalities. So the point is, especially the higher cortical levels of your brain are very, very functionally flexible in childhood. Now, by the time you're an adult, the pattern changes a little bit. Kind of looks like your brain dies into its adult configuration. That's an interesting way to look at it, which is to say, you have way more neurons than you need, especially right before you're born. And environment prunes your brain down to its adult configuration. So, although of course you develop connections as well, but you lose a lot of neurons. So, and by the time you're an adult, your brain is nowhere near as flexible as it was when you were a child. And if you sustain damage to certain parts of your brain that are already specialized, well, then you have the damage and you can work around it and all that, but it can still be really permanent. Question.
So that's sort of Lamarckian
Yeah, that's right. That's
it's
a good
not,
comment.
because the brain adapts, whereas the body.
Yeah, that's a great comment. You know, and if you start thinking about that, it has really revolutionary implications. So you can say, for example, if I have an idea that's really radical, and say, in a sense, that changes the configuration of my cortex, I can transmit that, maybe not to you, maybe your brain is already fixed, so to speak, but down the generations and alter the structure of brains henceforth. So you could say, well, ideas can spread throughout a population that way. That's a Lamarckian spread. But even more interestingly, I think, is, and this is speculative, of course, but let's say that there are certain types of revolutions in thought that are actually the consequences of biological mutations. So you could say that, well, you're a particularly odd sort of person from the genetic perspective, and as a consequence, you think in a very, very unique manner. But the thing that's so interesting is that if you can still communicate those thoughts, then the effect of that genetic mutation can be transmitted throughout the population without any biological alteration at the genetic level at all. So that's really something that's interesting, because it means that the consequence of genetic mutations on cognition can spread throughout the population as fast as communication can move. So that's, yeah, the Lamarckian, does everybody know what Lamarckian transmission is? Well, Lamarck was the character who thought that the reason that you could transmit acquired characteristics. So the reason giraffes have long necks is because they kept trying to stretch their necks, basically, and they transmitted the capacity to do the stretching to their offspring. So you could transmit acquired characteristics down the genetic line. Now you can't do that. That's wrong, but that's what Lamarck thought. But he wasn't completely wrong, because that is how this sort of transmission works. It's non-genetically mediated accumulation of biological resources. So that's very interesting.